Hello, and welcome to the Skillful podcast, where we explore DBT and RODBT skills to help you reduce emotional suffering, improve your relationships, and become more present in your life. I'm your host, Mariel Berg, a psychotherapist at the Bay Area DBT and Couples Counseling Center. Today, we're going to be talking about your relationship with yourself. So we've been exploring on the podcast a bunch of different skills that help you navigate your relationship with others, but we haven't spent a lot of time on talking about how you talk to yourself and how, what your internal dialogue is. So we're going to dive into that today.
And I do think this is a really important topic when it comes to interpersonal relationships, because our relationship with ourselves is the relationship that we spend the most time on. And we often spend the least conscious time cultivating in a way that we, consciously cultivate relationships with others. And yet that relationship with ourselves is really a foundation on which all of our relationships are built.
For many people, they might not even be familiar with the concept of having a relationship with themselves. But we all have internal dialogues and ways of relating to ourselves that, as you said, Ed, are often unconscious, that are just kind of playing out in the background. And so we're hoping today to get people thinking and wondering about how they talk to themselves, particularly when they're going through a hard time. One thing that is so common is that for so many people, when we're struggling, we can get really harsh with ourselves, when what's needed often is kindness and compassion and patience.
And I think it's such a common tactic for self-motivation is just be tough, be that tough coach to say, hey, keep going. You got to do better. You got to keep trying. And we can overuse that kind of approach. And I think it's a really, really common thing to develop a sense of self-motivation that is almost exclusively self-critical.
Yes. And that's a common objection often to when we talk to people about what we're going to talk about today, which is self-compassion, and in particular, the skill called loving kindness, mindfulness practice, or loving kindness meditation, which is borrowed from the Buddhist practice of Metta. That's often something that people will come back with, like, but I can't be nice to myself or loving with myself because I won't get anything done. Like, the way I motivate myself is by being critical.
And when that comes up a lot when I'm working with people, and my question always is, well, how is that working out? And almost always I just get a blank stare of like, oh, maybe not so effective. But at the same time, if it's all we know, and I certainly have overused self-criticism and had periods in my life where it's like I really did not know how to be kind to myself. If all I know is how to criticize myself, and that's the only way I know to motivate myself, and it's not really working that well, I'm at a loss, and I need something concrete to do that would actually be compassionate.
Yes. And you're talking about overusing self-criticism, and I feel like self-criticism is rarely, if ever, very useful. And I think it can get sort of conflated with accountability, or we can think like, if I'm not critical with myself, how am I going to be accountable to myself and others? But I think there's certainly a way to be accountable and be responsible that doesn't involve that self-criticism, or what I think both of us often see when we're working with folks is more like a self-flagellation. It's so extreme. Like, I'm a terrible person. I'm a loser. God, I mess this up. I mess everything up.
Right.
That kind of thing that can happen in people's heads.
Right. Yeah, I had a teacher once who was so good with this kind of stuff about relationship with self. And one of the things that she would say is, if I went with you through your day and you whispered in my ear everything that you say to yourself over the course of the day, would I have a good day or a bad day? And when she would say this in the context of like a workshop or a speech or something like that, people would laugh, because I think most of us, if you think about it, ooh, if I said to other people the things that I say to myself all day long, they would probably be horrified at how harsh that is. And I think often when it comes to that kind of motivation through self-criticism, to think about, would I ever motivate someone else in this way that I'm trying to motivate myself? Would I ever speak to someone else in this way and say, you're a loser, you're terrible, you can never do anything right, you need to stop, you need to get over it? Would I do that to someone else?
And the answer almost always is no. And so when we're thinking about how we talk to ourselves, or more broadly about self-compassion, and I'm also drawing here on the work of Mindful Self-Compassion by Christopher Garner and Kristen Neff, and we'll link to those resources in the show notes. So if a good friend called you and they told you that they're really upset because they didn't get a job offer that they were hoping to get, how would you respond to them? So you likely would not respond the way you would respond to yourself. If your friend tells you they're upset because they didn't get this job offer they wanted, you would probably offer understanding and patience. You would validate. You might say things like, I'm sorry you're hurting. That's really painful. Maybe you'd reassure them that something else good would come along. You might say things like, of course you're upset. You really wanted that. You might ask, how can I help? How can I be here for you? You wouldn't say, you're stupid. You wouldn't berate yourself. You wouldn't insult them. You wouldn't tell them they deserved it, which is so often what we might tell ourselves.
And I think you probably wouldn't say, of course you didn't get that job, you were stupid to even try to get that job, you know?
Yes. Yeah.
But what you might say is, I know this is really hard. I still have hope that you will get a good job for you. I still believe in you. Being able to acknowledge the loss, but also hold that hope, which is often easier to do with someone else, and really valuable if we can try to start to turn that towards ourselves.
I'm so glad you brought that piece up in terms of hope, because that is something that we can offer to others so much more easily, because we can see the sort of whole course of how things unfold, and we can know that bad things can happen to our friends and good things, and we can feel hopeful for them. But when we are disappointed or upset or suffering in some way, it's so challenging to access that hope and that belief that things will shift. And things always do shift. Not always for the better all the time.
Right. Yeah, nothing is permanent.
Yeah.
And I think that, again, using the approach we would use with someone else gives us that sense of what's possible, even as it can be really hard, for instance, in a moment of loss, to have hope within ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Much easier to have for someone else with a little bit more objectivity and distance.
Yes. And another piece of mindful self-compassion work is around acknowledging what is called our common humanity. And what we mean by that is acknowledging and respecting when we're going through a hard time, that everyone goes through hard times, and that this is part of being human. Because often when we are struggling emotionally, we can make it worse by thinking we're the only one, or we're the only one who's feeling lonely or afraid, or we're uniquely flawed in some way. So if you can feel more connected to our common humanity, which at times is the experience of suffering, you can feel less alone in your pain. And the skill we're going to talk about, the loving kindness, mindfulness meditation, it speaks to this common humanity piece as well.
Because I do think in our relationship with ourselves, it is us with us, which can feel isolating at times. And we don't have the same perspective as we have in relationship with others who have totally different perspectives than we do. And there may be similarities, but they have their own life experience. And that in communication between the two of us, we can put those together and recognize, oh, there's a lot of commonality here. In our relationship with ourselves, it's a little harder to make that connection. And that's where a practice like loving kindness can help us strive towards that awareness that I'm not alone. It's not just me. There's a common experience of humanity that I am tapping into right now.
So let's lay out what exactly this loving kindness mindfulness meditation is. So it's a series of statements. There's 4 of them. You can tweak them as you like, but I suggest that you try to keep them simple. And if you are new to this skill, that you try out the ones we are offering here, which, as always, we're working out of Marshall Linehan's DBT handouts and worksheets, and we'll link again to that in the show notes, so you can look that up if you want to and get more detail about this skill. But the loving kindness meditation is a series of these 4 statements that are, you might say, are well wishes. You can use the word prayer if that resonates for you, but you do not have to be religious in any way to engage with this skill. It's sort of a wishing for the best for others and then ultimately for yourself. So the 4 statements that we start with are, may I be safe, may I be happy, may I be healthy, and may I live with ease. So I put that all in the, with the I. And so we're actually going to probably back up and we'll talk about why, when you're beginning with loving kindness, you might want to try sending it to other people first before you send it to yourself, because that can be the most challenging. So if you're sending this loving kindness to someone else, it would be, may you be safe, may you be happy, may you be healthy, may you live with ease.
And I think that the simplicity of this practice is that we cultivate this sense of openness to others and ultimately also to ourselves, simply by just repeating these sentences as a way to deepen our felt sense of what these mean and direct it towards others, direct it towards ourselves. So just 4 simple sentences with a little bit of direction can actually change the way we feel.
Yes. And I think that, so this is, it really is, it's a mindfulness skill. So it's a way you can practice mindfulness. Particularly, it can be helpful to have sort of like a mantra, these 4 lines that you repeat to yourself over and over. If you find other mindfulness exercises like following your breath more challenging, because it gives your brain something to focus on. So it's essentially a mindfulness skill, but it also, I think about this loving kindness meditation as part of our self-soothing skills, which are part of distress tolerance. It's a way that you can soothe yourself when you're feeling that you're way in emotion mind and feeling really upset. I know you've talked, Ed, very clearly about how you think about it in terms of opposite action if you use this loving kindness with someone you're angry with.
Yeah, I think that, again, like if you are feeling really angry or frustrated with someone else or with yourself, and recognize that that's really fueled by a lot of assumptions and judgments, interpretations, not so much facts based, or not effective to be angry in the moment. One way to cultivate an opposite action of openness, so rather than being angry and closed and wanting to maybe lash out or push back, opposite action would be to be open. And this is a way to cultivate openness.
Yes, and let's do like a super quick review of opposite action. So we use opposite action when our emotion doesn't fit the facts, or acting on our emotion might not be effective. So if you're feeling angry with someone and it doesn't fit the facts, or acting on it isn't effective, and a lot of times with anger it isn't, not all the time, enough of the time, one of the suggestions is to act opposite to that anger, is to be a little nice to the person you're angry with. And sometimes that can feel like a bit of a stretch. So I think of loving kindness meditation as a way to at least internally act a little nice towards the person you're angry with by sending them these well wishes.
Yeah, exactly.
So when we're teaching this in group, we have people first think of a neutral person. And so if you're listening along, you can think about that for yourself. We start with the neutral person because we want to start with practicing the skill with someone where there's not a lot of charge. So you can think about sending it to someone, you see at the grocery store regularly, maybe the checkout person who you don't particularly have any feelings about, or, your mail person or a neighbor that you don't know, someone who's neutral. And begin by sending them these well wishes. May you be safe. May you be happy. May you be healthy. May you be at ease. And see how that feels within you.
Then the next level would be to send this loving kindness to someone that you actually have love for. So starting with someone neutral gives us a little bit of practice, and then sending loving kindness towards someone that we actually have love for and deep care. And noticing when you practice that, saying these 4 sentences kind of as a mantra, what do you notice within yourself when you send these well wishes of loving kindness to someone that you have deep care for?
And for most people, it feels really good because if it's someone you love, or if there isn't someone in your life right now who you can love without a lot of extra noise, like someone, because there might be people in our life that we love that we also have conflict with. So you can choose a pet or something where you can really just sort of bask in how you really want this person to be safe, happy, healthy, or at ease, person or pet.
Right.
So that can bring up a lot of positive feelings.
Right. And I think it's interesting to notice the difference from someone neutral to someone that we actually have care for and positive feelings towards, and notice the difference when we do the same meditation or reflection for those 2 different people. And then move on to something maybe a little bit more challenging,
which is trying to send loving kindness to someone you're angry with. And we suggest that you don't pick the person in your life that you are most angry with or who has hurt you the most, because it's going to be really hard. So if you're new to this, picking someone who there's a more mild anger or annoyance or frustration with, just to see what it's like to actually, in your mind, send someone who you're angry with well wishes. And this is where the opposite action comes in. So you get to experiment with being a little kind to someone that you're angry with, at least in your head.
Right. And with most of our practice of skills in interpersonal effectiveness, we encourage people not to pick the person that you have the hardest time with, because you start with the biggest stretch, not necessarily going to be really effective. So starting with someone that you have some frustration with, and then see what do you notice. And when we do this in group, oftentimes people will say, like, I definitely noticed feeling different, feeling more open, having more understanding for that person, so that this practice can really shift the way we feel towards someone else. And when we do this in group, there's always experiences where people say, no, actually, I just couldn't do it. It was too hard. It was too much of a stretch. So you play with it.
Yeah. And that might be because you pick someone who you really are not, there's been too much hurt or boundary crossing where it's not the right time or place to wish them well.
Mm-hmm.
Then try to pick someone who's a little less charged. And what people I know from myself I've noticed is that when I try this, there's a softening of the anger. It doesn't mean that everything they did is okay, or I'm excusing behavior that may have hurt me, but there's a softening of the edges or the intensity of the emotion.
And again, I think it gets into that balance of acceptance and change that is a huge dialectical focus in DBT. And so, practicing loving kindness towards someone that we're frustrated with is really focusing more on the acceptance side of things. And like when we talk about radical acceptance in distress tolerance, being able to have more acceptance can open up more possibilities around change. So we may be able to have more clarity about how to deal with the frustrations by starting with developing and cultivating a little bit of acceptance. So just focusing on that side isn't saying that we won't try to change the things that frustrate us. We're putting that off until later. We'll consider that later. Right now, we're just focusing on this loving kindness meditation and seeing what happens.
Yes. And then next level, the final level, is sending it to yourself. So may I be safe. May I be happy. May I be healthy. May I live with ease. And so I've repeated this several times here because what we want is for people to kind of memorize these, so you can just sort of repeat them over and over, and you'll get it if you with some practice, of course. And at least the way I was originally taught to do this was to wait to send it to myself before I practice in all these different ways, sending it to a neutral person, sending it to someone I loved, sending it to someone I was angry with, and then sending it to myself. Because for so many people, sending this loving kindness, as we talked about in the beginning of this episode, being self-compassionate, being kind, being gentle with ourselves, can be the most challenging. And you can contrast it when you try to send it to yourself, the difference between when you send it to someone that you love, where there's a real heart opening experience very often. When you send it to yourself, it can feel really uncomfortable.
And when we do this exercise in our groups, there are always numerous people after we practice sending the loving kindness to ourselves who say that was really hard. I really struggled with that. And so you may find that when you practice this yourself, that you also find like, wow, I didn't realize how hard it is for me to actually send kindness to myself and cultivate openness and caring towards myself. And that's helpful information to have, even though that can be disconcerting.
Yeah. And so don't be discouraged if you find that, because it is, it happens with some regularity. So it's, in some ways, it's to be expected. If you don't struggle with it, fabulous. But if you do, watch the judgments or the self-criticism that you might pile on. Like, I can't even send myself loving kindness right.
And that's the advantage when we do this in group, is that people are able to hear, oh, I'm not the only one who struggles with this, and can take it more as like, aha, isn't that interesting? I guess maybe I want to work on this, as opposed to, see, you can't even do loving kindness right, which is
Right.
really the opposite of what we're going for here.
Yes. And so just as you would wish all this for someone you love or care about, you're wishing yourself well. And as I said earlier, this can be very soothing. So I think of it as a distress tolerance skill. If you can kind of repeat these phrases to yourself as a mantra. And for some people, it's their primary meditation practice.
Mm-hmm.
So some other things that might make it difficult to send yourself loving kindness or to be self-compassionate in general is a sense of, I don't deserve it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that language of deserving is usually not effective. It's a moving target. And I wonder, like, who's assessing that?
Right. According to who do I not deserve this?
And to bring us back to what we talked about earlier, if someone we love or a good friend deserves it, like, why are we less than?
Right. And I think if you do notice that is a barrier that for you, I don't deserve this, to just have a stance of putting that to the side and trying the loving kindness to see what happens, to see if that changes, maintaining a little bit of openness from the perspective of, like, we whether we want to or not, we do need to have a relationship with ourselves. We are with ourselves all day, every day. And so if I am struggling with openness to myself, whether I deserve it or not, maybe I can put that to the side and try to practice and see what happens. The other thing I would say is that oftentimes, if you're really struggling to develop this self-compassion, you're probably not going to be able to do it on your own, and you will need help from a therapist or a friend or a trusted loved one, to help you work on this, and come to terms with and confront the ways that you're holding yourself back from that openness to yourself.
Yes, that this is a process, and if you have a lifetime of being harsh to yourself, then it's gonna take time to build a different kind of internal dialogue. And often we treat ourselves the way we were treated. So if you were raised with a lot of criticism or punishment or invalidation, then of course you're going to grow up and treat yourself in a similar way.
And I think one of the things that can help with that is basically, trying to understand and recognize that very often when caretakers are harsh, and then when we take that on and we are harsh with ourselves, it's from a place of trying to motivate, of wanting to protect, of wanting safety, and thinking that harshness is the most effective way to create safety, when, again, as we've discussed, it often is not. And so rather than judging it, just noticing it, acknowledging it. Yep, I grew up in a harsh environment. I've taken on harshness towards myself. It is what it is. Probably done to try to help, but is not helping so much right now. What can I do to move forward?
Yeah, and I'm thinking of the question you say, Ed, that you ask people when they talk about motivating themselves through criticism, which is like, how is that working?
Right.
Because if we don't question it, we just think it is, or that's
Right.
the only way to do
Right.
it.
And again, I think that in DBT, we hold effectiveness as the standard we're going for, as opposed to good or bad, deserving or undeserving. So rather than the question of, do I deserve to be open with myself? The question of, is it effective to prioritize criticism or harshness? And if it's not, then what are some other possibilities? Loving kindness, self-compassion, those are some options to try.
Yes. And even though it can be so challenging in the beginning, what I find is, this comes up in our groups, is that people often come back to the skill over and over. And actually, as we're talking, I'm remembering that years ago when I first started teaching DBT, this was not a skill I regularly taught because I was following along in Marsha Linehan's manual, and there's so much to get to. We don't have a lot of time. And so that wasn't one of the ones that was absolutely necessary. She had marked off certain skills you must cover. And this was more of an optional one. And there was never just time to get to it. And I remember I had a week in skills group where I think it was maybe before the holidays, and it didn't make sense to start a whole new module because we were going to have like a 3-week break. And I thought, let me try this skill because I had my own experience with practicing loving kindness. And I said, let me teach this to the group. And I was just sort of amazed as, in the months following, how many times when we did check in about other skills that people were using or what they were relying on to help themselves, how it came up over and over. And I thought, this is something I want the people that we work with to get on a regular basis. I want everyone to be exposed to this. I think it can be so beneficial, even though it can be challenging.
Yeah. I do think that when people give this skill a shot and try the loving kindness practice, they often find that there is an impact. And again, we offered those 4 categories of sending loving kindness: someone neutral, someone you care for, someone you're frustrated with, and yourself. And usually people find that not every single one of those 4 is meaningful to them. Usually people find at least one of those is like, oh, wow, that was powerful. I felt something that shifted something. So giving this a shot, I think, often gives people an opportunity to add a skill that can be really useful.
Yes. And maybe let's just talk about another objection or two, or common objections that we hear in case listeners are thinking this as they're kind of following along. And one is some variation of, it's selfish. Selfish to spend time wishing good things for myself. And I think that actually being kind to ourselves can help us show up more fully for others. Like the softer we are, the more patient and loving we are with ourselves. And again, don't confuse softness with means that we don't work hard, we don't motivate ourselves. But I think it has the potential to make us more kind, caring, and forgiving with others.
Yeah, I think that when I am being really hard on myself and impatient with myself, I tend to be more impatient with others. When I cultivate patience and openness and kindness towards myself, I feel that more easily towards others as well. And so it could be kind of selfish to not do this, not cultivate openness, because it does impact so much in our lives.
Mm-hmm. And many folks have been raised with the value of being kind to others. And in that equation often isn't being kind to ourselves, or that can be viewed as too self-focused. So I'm glad that we kind of turned it on its head a little bit to think about how, if that's a value for you, being kind with others, that this can be a side effect.
And I think about the quote unquote golden rule of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I think that the inverse can also be helpful of do unto myself as I would have others do unto me.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that.
Because most people do not like when other people are really super critical and trying to motivate through harshness. It doesn't feel good. So if I wouldn't do it to others and I wouldn't like it if they did it to me, why would I keep doing that with myself? If I would really appreciate some loving kindness in people's approach to me, maybe that's what I want to approach myself with. So when thinking about how to actually do this, as Mariella said, you have the 4 statements. May you or I be safe. May you be happy. May you be healthy. May you live with ease. And just finding a quiet space to just kind of go inward, either closing your eyes or looking down so that your attention is within rather than around the room around you. And just taking a couple of minutes. I think it oftentimes can be helpful to set a little alarm for maybe 2 minutes or 3 minutes or 1 minute or 30 seconds, depending on your tolerance, or 10 seconds, right? Whatever's going to be effective for you. And just like repeat those 4 sentences or some other kind of mantra of kindness and openness that you create for yourself, and just repeat it and sit with it and notice what you feel as you do that.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. To learn more, or if you're in the Bay Area and want to get started with therapy, you can find us online at bayareadbtcc.com. That's bayareadbtcc.com.